Magick.me is the world's greatest school for magic, meditation, and mysticism. You can learn everything there, from chaos magic to hermeticism to meditation to how to supercharge your finances and take absolute control of your destiny. In short, you get all of the tools you need to turn chaos into beautiful, scintillating order and master your life. It's incredible. You've probably heard me talk about it on the show quite a lot. But check it out. It's growing fast. And I just want to say, if you're confused about where to start, because I have so many courses there, the Adept Initiative is the place to go. The Adept Initiative is the flagship course on Magick.me, and it contains everything you need to know to master the most profound ancient techniques of changing your consciousness and the most modern and cutting-edge tools and systems for absolutely turning your life into a masterpiece. You are really going to dig it. Go check it out, and I will see you in class. It's magick.me, magick.me.
Yes, hello. Welcome back to the Ultra Culture podcast. I'm extremely excited about my guest today. I have on Lionel Snell, who is often known as Ramsey Dukes, his pen name. One of the best writers on Magick currently or at any time, I would say. He is one of the primary kind of movers of chaos magic, one of the original people to conceptualize chaos magic as a practice, and he's been doing great books ever since. He is criminally underappreciated. I recommend you read all of his stuff, and also check out his YouTube. He's been doing amazing YouTubes. His channel is just called Ramsey Dukes. He is extremely funny. He is great at thought experiments. He is like the world's best thought experimenter, I would say. Here's a little bit about him from Wikipedia. Lionel Snell is a contemporary English magician, publisher, and author on magic and philosophy who was published under the pen names Ramsey Dukes and many others. Let's see. In 1977, he performed a well-known but notably laborious and rarely attempted ritual called the Abramelin Operation. He's recently published his diaries from that time period. Since 1972, he has written and published several books noted for their impact on late 20th century magic and humor. Words Made Flesh from 1987 was written from a more philosophical point of view and notable for its original outline of the information model theory of magic, that our universe could be a virtual reality, as later explored in The Matrix. It is an example of the author's ongoing studies in the relationship between magic and rationalism. So one of the things I really appreciate about Ramsey Dukes' writing is he doesn't use any jargon. He doesn't use magic terminology. He puts everything in completely everyday common sense language so that literally anybody could understand it. And one of the most important and potent things about that is that he really dramatically shows you by doing this that magic is something that's right in front of your face right now. You don't need to stretch yourself to, ridiculous lengths of taking psychedelics or dressing up funny or anything like that. You just need a slight perception shift, a slightly different way of looking at the world, maybe a different language set of conceptualizing your day-to-day experience, and then voila, the magical universe opens up to you. This is one of the great things I've learned from his books. I really recommend his Uncle Ramsey's Little Book of Demons, as well as his recent kind of autobiographical book, My Years of Magical Thinking. But check out his YouTube. That's probably the best place to start. All right. So without any further ado, please welcome Ramsey Dukes. So first of all, it's a huge honor to have you on the podcast. You are one of my favorite writers on magic ever, and I think one of the best writers on magic ever. And you've always been a great inspiration to me, and just an incredibly entertaining writer. And the thing that I find most helpful and enlightening about your writing is that you take the very brave stance of never using jargon, which I think you talk about in your videos. And
yes, that's yeah.
It's interestingly enough, and I one of the reasons that is so I mean, it's so inspiring for me just because to force yourself to write in that way or to communicate in that way so that anyone can, I think it does make it so that anyone can understand it, but also B, it forces you to be clear about what you're actually doing instead of diluting I'm not saying you, but somebody writing in that way instead of using jargon.
That's interesting. Yes. Yeah, I'd sort of forgotten that aspect. The thing is that for many years I've been earning my money as a technical writer, broad coverage, PRs, articles, video scripts, all sorts of things. And of course, they really want you to use jargon until you're practically puking from it. So I got one instinct: I don't like jargon. The other thing is, in the occult, there are so many different schools and traditions, things like that, that on the whole, you're committing yourself or being seen as committing yourself to a certain thing if you use that jargon. So yeah, I'm conscious of not wanting to do that.
That makes sense. That's interesting. You bring up technical writing. One thing I realized working in the corporate world and also in the tech world and in the finance world, just noticing them as well as medical professions, I realized at a certain point that jargon is a way of maintaining job security and convincing people that you know things that they don't. And interestingly, so that you have to basically maintain your job as the expert in the office at IT or being a doctor or taking people's money to invest. And then when really usually these things aren't that complicated. So interestingly, applying that to magic, when you write about it, it just totally makes sense as something that everyone is already doing. The classic thing that I always think about is the bit you wrote about how to see auras, or maybe if you can riff off that, because that's something that I think people would love to hear about.
Well, it's that was probably in How to See Fairies in that book. The thing is that I really began that book saying, if you've got this book, you would like to see fairies or be clairvoyant, whatever. How do you know you're not? And I said that people have experiences, weird experiences, and they explain them away because of the sort of rationalist culture we're brought up in. So, out of the corner of your eye, you see a sort of strange fluttering in the undergrowth or something. And rather than thinking, oh, I wonder if that's a fairy, you stare hard and it's not there. So things like auras, if you gaze at someone and hold your gaze, you do begin a sort of a quivering of the edges, but what we're taught to do is to blink, and that goes away. You've cleared it, you've normalized it. And I said that if you accept what you're seeing, if you accept these sort of messages that are coming through intuitively, rather than instinctively banishing them, which is what we're trained to do, oh, nonsense. One example I've been doing more recently is, I'm trying to remember the word they use for it, when you see things which are not actually there. There's some sort of parallelia or something. Do you know the word I mean?
I don't know.
Oh, right. Let me think. Pete Carroll wrote some good stuff about it. People see faces in clouds. And you're told, of course, there aren't any faces in clouds. It's just your mind is imagining it. Actually, I thought, I want to see faces in clouds. So I started looking at clouds for faces, and I learned how to do it. And it was wonderful because practicing that, I began to see faces everywhere, in undergrowth, in the leaves and things like that. And some people say, well, that's me going balmy, I'm now becoming deluded. No, it was like the world around me coming to life, all these wonderful faces, so it became a new conversation with nature and with life. And so that's rather an angle I like to take, exploring, finding new ways of looking at the world, new wonderment. And so I think, that's the sort of thing I was referring to in that book, how to open up your senses to more experiences rather than saying, oh, that must be imagination, turn it off.
I love that because it makes it so direct and practical. And I think when people first get into magic, they get this idea that there's some extremity they have to push themselves to, whether it's doing enough psychedelics or there's some secret that they have to learn from a certain group of people and they really have to work at it. When really what you just said was, when I first started, it was so helpful for me and it confirmed so much that I'd already been thinking, which is just, that it's really a way of, I think of magic as a language for describing things that are already there. And then when you just stop yourself from, when you stop yourself from stopping engaging with those things, then suddenly it just becomes completely common sense and right in front of you.
I sometimes draw a comparison with, the way some people approach magic is the way people approach science. Now, as a kid, you get these wonderful books, The Wonders of Science, rockets into space, nuclear power and all these things like that. And if you say, right, okay, wow, I want to be a scientist, and you think that you're immediately going to be making, splitting the atom, you're going to be flying to Mars, this, that, and the other. Because actually, if you start on your science lessons, you're doing things like, for chemistry, you're learning lists and lists of valences, and sort of, for physics, you're weighing little things and putting them on each other and measuring the temperature. And so it actually starts from very small things. And I feel the same about magic. Some people think they want to get to the big stuff, visions of eternity and so on and so forth. Now, that to me is a bit like getting into an airplane and flying to another country. Fascinating, you have a great experience. But when you come back home, it all seems very far away. You have your amazing trip, and then you're back in your everyday life, and you're going to work the next day, and you've got your washing up to do and that sort of thing. And it's like a sort of drops you back, and it's almost, the other stuff is like a dream. Whereas I'm often saying, take a fresh look at look at it from a different angle. And it's like you're opening a door from your everyday reality into something else. Now, if you go through that door, you can keep going and discover the really weird stuff. But the important thing for me is really you discover that in this everyday reality, which can seem very humdrum, there are doors which open up to otherness and weirdness. And that is really, I think, probably the gift I'm giving people. I'm not saying there isn't all this fantastic stuff far away and all that, by all means, but it's worth knowing that the journey begins with just stepping out, which is so mundane.
I love that. That makes it. I love that phrase. Also, you said doorway to a doorway to otherness. Is that what you said, or did I just get it wrong?
Yeah, so that was it. Yes.
I love that. Let me ask you this. I mean, I'll just go for the big question, which at this point, after thinking about this and writing about this, and I'm sure you've, and having done many, many books about magic, I'm sure your mind has changed quite a bit about what exactly magic is. And I'm sure that's been an interesting process. I'll just say this, how would you define magic now? What is magic to you now in your day-to-day life, in your understanding of it? And is that different from what you thought it was when you started out?
Now, the trouble with that question for me is I'm not a person who really goes in for definitions. I go in for exploring to see what I find. And I could give an analogy of that some people, when they go into nature, and this is a more academic approach, they know what they're looking for. We're going to go to find the lesser spotted woodpecker. They look for the lesser spotted woodpecker, and they see something and say, that's it. And the person says, no, it hasn't got red under its tail, so it's not the lesser spotted woodpecker. Oh, I see, okay. And some people approach magic like that. What exactly is it? Now, I like to wander into nature just to see what I find, to revel in the marvel of it. And so I don't really like strictly defining magic. But having said that, yeah, what I think is instead is there are many ways of looking at magic. And I'll present one way, which is I've been thinking about recently. And that is if you think of magic as the sort of the territory that lies between science and art, then you could say there's the sort of the scientific edge of it, and there's the artistic side of it. Now, the scientific thing, I came up with this when I was chatting recently with Pete Carroll, because he, I say, approached it from the science end. And science end is is the desire for power to make changes, how we can learn in order to do that. And the artistic end is more about experience, wanting to see things in a new way, have more experience. And so I think that people mostly come into magic because they want to make changes in conformity with will. But I remember a number of times I was talking to groups of pagans, and I said, you know, over the years, I probably do less magic, but I live more magic. And I often notice quite a few heads nodding in the audience. And I think that many people follow that path. They begin by wanting to make changes, make things happen and all that. And they discover that actually magic becomes a way of life where they're more interested in enjoying what happens from the magical perspective. They find it gives them a richer life experience. And I think that's quite true for me, that I do less power magic to make things happen. And I'm more enjoying the richness of experience that living magically is showing me. So in saying that, I haven't sort of defined magic, but maybe I've shown an angle of magic which is fresh. You know, other people might not see it that way.
Yes, I really love that. Maybe can I ask you, what are the angles of magic that you're most interested in exploring, or what are the corners of nature that are most interesting to you right now?
Let me think. I'm interested in the astrological models, and trying to relate, say, major astrological events to what's going on in the world. And it isn't always an easy connection, but there's one I've been very much aware of for about the last, I'm not terribly good at dates, but maybe the last 10 to 5 years. And that is the motion of Pluto through Capricorn. I don't know if you've looked into that at all or heard people talking about it.
The only thing I know about Pluto is it at times foments revolution, anarchy, and chaos, which was, of course, very interesting to me. But that's about all.
Yeah, and it sort of shakes the foundations. Now, the very interesting thing that Liz Green wrote, and this was back in the early 80s, so it's very perceptive. She said that she talked about when Pluto was going to move into Capricorn, which is where it is now and has been for quite a while. And she said, Capricorn, people associate it with sort of the structure of society, you know, governments, bureaucracy, and all that. And so that's going to get a shake-up in that time. But she said also she thinks Capricorn is more about society's fundamental sense of what is real, what is the foundation, you know, the solid Saturnian stuff. And she said that could be shaken up by Pluto and Capricorn. And I find that very interesting because, of course, I can see signs of that sense of what is real, what is solid, being shaken over the last few years in several different ways. In politics, it's, you know, the post-truth thing, and the old certainties are shaking. In terms of materialism, the sciences, I mean, they've been saying this for a long time, but I think it's getting through to the public that the old rock-solid world of solid objects and actions and repeatable actions isn't quite as solid as we've been led to believe. And then an example I'm vaguely aware of is in academia. Now, academia was always very anti-occult, anti-magic. You know, it was, well, back in the 50s, it just wasn't mentioned. And then you got I think in the 70s, when people, you could write about it in academia as a pathology, you know, like the flux, you know, why is it that people sort of go crazy and flight from reason? But since the beginning of this century and more recently, you can write academically about magic, well, as you have in your John Dee book, you know, as you don't necessarily have to believe it or go along with it, but you have to admit it's an important part of human culture. It's influential, you know, so that's quite a shift. And I think people in academia who are studying magic are still pretty wary of, you know, they don't want to go native, you know, they've got to keep their distance in that. But it's okay to talk about it as an important cultural factor. And that's a major shift. And I think it might shift further, you know, that actually, they might actually start admitting that magic can work. And, you know, it's not just a delusion.
I definitely agree with that. And it's also just, and you can't argue that magic has not been a part of human history deeply and profoundly across cultures since the beginning of history. And I have noticed that shift in academia as well. And even when I started out with magic, it was not that way, and it shifted. And to be to be a little bit reductive about that, I have the suspicion that one of the reasons that is because a lot of current academics grew up reading Harry Potter and wanting that experience, and they had their view of what academia could be shaped by those books, and the idea of kind of being in a cloistered educational environment and researching magic was so potent for so many people that I think it only makes sense that a certain crop of academics would have kind of had that script, you know, setting their model of what they were doing in the academy.
But that's great. Yes, there was a sort of turning point example which was interesting to me. It was just about around 2000. Nicholas Goodrick Clark got a position in Exeter University, and of course they wouldn't call it magic or the occult. It was like I think it was the Western esoteric tradition or something like that, or, you know, esotericism probably was the word. And this was very exciting. You know, here was a serious university actually having a course and a department look at this. And I went to visit him and stay with him one weekend. And I said, wow, you know, that's amazing that academia is actually sort of, and he said, well, yes and no, because yeah, he is now a department in the university, but he's still seen as a bit of a freak show, you know, sort of giggle, you know, we've actually got a department of esotericism. Oh, blimey, you know. So what looked like an amazing breakthrough was actually a sort of a leak.
Yeah.
Just getting the seeds were sown.
Do you know Tobias Churton? Have you met him at all?
Oh, yes. Well, I have. I know him indirectly through Christopher McIntosh, good friends. And yes, he's definitely one of those people, a student of you know, student of esotericism, which is increasingly accepted. Yes, what were you going to say about him? Sorry.
I think I could be wrong. I think he was part of that program. And the last I asked him, I believe I asked him about it a few years ago, and he said that either it had shut down or had been a lot of funding had been pulled from it. And I don't know the exact details, but he seemed a bit crestfallen about it.
Yeah. Well, Nicholas died not long after I visited him. So, not soon after 2000. And Christopher McIntosh had been one of the lecturers there. And so I knew that it had passed on. But there are, I think, quite a few universities through Europe that still have their courses, and there are quite serious academic conferences on the subject. There was one held in Europe, I think in Germany, a year or two back, and Raphael Prink was actually discussing my views on Magick at an academic conference. I thought, ooh, whippy,
That's great.
love it. And so, yeah, and actually this year, in September, I've been invited to a conference in the University of Northampton, one called, is it called Trans States? I don't know if you've heard of that.
No, I haven't.
Then, well, it looks fascinating to me because they looked at it, they based the theme on a different tarot card. I think last year they said it was the Tower, and the first year it was the Magician. No, this year it's the Magician, and so they're looking at the whole trickster aspect of magic. So including stage magic, conjuring, and all that. And they've asked me to come and be a keynote speaker, which
lovely.
I've never done that before, but that is absolutely amazing to me, to be a keynote speaker in a sort of a fairly academic conference.
They picked the right person. That's excellent. That's excellent.
Yeah. Well, I'm really looking forward to it. Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. And there's, outside of the opening of interest in academia, there's also just the internet and just going from the time of zines and underground publishing and kind of counterculture newspapers and magazines to the internet. It's just undeniable now that information has opened up that everybody wants to know about magic and they have access to it. And I think one of the really surprisingly profound things that's happened is I think magic is a little bit like pornography in the sense that now once people can consume it privately without having to go to a shop to buy it, suddenly they're a lot less reticent to do so. and that's something that I've noticed just in teaching online and things like that. I get people taking the courses that never would have been, you would never have expected to show up to like a pagan meetup or a chaos magic meetup or something like that. And it's been interesting to me to see that it's really endemic across society and class lines and country lines and language lines. And that's been really, really encouraging to me. I know you did
Yeah, I was going to say there's actually a lot I would like to ask you about that because you're really in the thick of what's happening. I'm stuck out at the very tip of Africa, next stop, the Antarctica.
Well, I never leave. I never leave the house, so I feel kind of in the same boat. But I'm just online all day long. So.
Right. Oh, yeah. But you're online. Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
I mean, there was one thing was a few years ago, maybe about 5 years ago or so, some sort of trend spotting agency announced proudly, and it was in several newspapers, the trend of the year is chaos magic.
Yes, I did see that.
Yeah, well, wildly excited. I posted it in Facebook, and then did anything happen? I mean,
I don't. Well, what was that? That was trying to remember. That group was called not K-pop, or K Cluster. It was something. It was K something. I would say that I don't know if anything directly came out of that, other than I think that the idea, and I'm biased because I see reality from my angle, so this is just what I'm looking for all day long. But I think that even since, even from, the days that I was involved in, of course, chaos magic groups and things like that in the late 90s and early 2000s, even from then, it has just gone from being still a very, very, very fringe idea to, I would say, being completely accepted by the art world. I think 100%. And I always go back to your model on that. And I think that the art world loves magic and the idea of magic, if not the practice of it. And I think that the reason that they like it is it's just a good place to mine material. There's so much, artistic and cultural material. It's kind of like just another place to plunder for, edgy and interesting artistic material. And I think they love it because, I mean, whether it's the art gallery world, particularly in New York, or kind of the crossover between art publishing and academic publishing, or musicians, music videos. I mean, I lived in London for a while too, but I lived in New York and L.A. for 20 years combined, and so I was able to see this happening a lot. And I think that you can see it in culture, whether it's the art world or music videos or movies and things like that. And my experience is just that artistic people just get this stuff immediately, but what they really like is the glamour of it, and you'll be extremely hard pressed and it may even be impossible in most cases, even in these cultural milieus, to find people who are, for instance, working through a series, actually practicing, or, heaven forbid, working through something like Liber MMM or Crowley or something like that. Although they are there, they love the image of it. So, and in a way, that kind of it's kind of like the letter killeth type situation, where they want the cast off, the simulacra of it, because they can sell it and be associated with the glamour themselves, but they're not necessarily willing to go full into the actual practice. And that kind of drives me nuts, because my point is, like, it's not the signifier, it's the signified. Like, all the symbols of magic are just the residue, they're the leftover. The point is actually learning the practice. So that's my take on it.
That's very interesting to me, actually, because it slightly reflects what I was saying at the beginning about, the artistic end of magic. And I would say they are enjoying experiencing magic more than actually doing it. It's another example of that, I think. From the artistic end, you realize that there's a whole other world of experience if you open yourself up to magic. It's a different way of looking at the world, is one of the things. You look at something you want to portray, and you're looking for something which goes beyond words and beyond symbols, and you're wanting to express it, which in a way is you're mining the magic of it, in finding that expression. And once you get into that frame of mind, you'll have your own way of getting it, whether it's meditating or contemplating, or like Austin Spare, exhausting yourself. You have your own personal way of getting into that space. And it may not be by putting on a robe and lighting incense and doing all that sort of thing. But you might use some of those elements all the same, What is it how does an artist prepare him or herself for inspiration? And they may do things which don't belong to any tradition, but actually they are their own magical practices. The way they get into that other frame of mind. Yeah.
That's always been the thing that interests me, which is what are the actual techniques? How do you actually do it so that you can have your own experience? But I think that a lot of you won't as necessarily find that in the art or cultural worlds as much as you'll find, like, people doing music videos with people in robes putting off a witchy aesthetic or something like that, which for me is just not particularly interesting. I feel like the kind of, maybe a good analogy I could find is that it's kind of similar to when you have, in terms of the art world's relationship with magic and wanting to kind of commodify it or latch onto it, which I suppose is good because it brings it out into the culture. But at the same time, it's kind of like when you have let's say, like a performer on stage that's in a kind of, if we can say a shamanic type performer, where you have someone like Ian Curtis or like Iggy Pop is cutting himself with a bottle on stage, and he's having this intense experience of performing and going into these ritual frenzy states and things like that. And then you have all these people kind of, standing around wearing black with their arms folded, saying like, oh, isn't this interesting, right? It's kind of like that same type of dynamic.
Mm. Gosh, that triggers several thoughts in me. One is remembering when I was at Cambridge, when I first went there, there was a sort of Dadaist revival. And this would be about 1960, early 60s, the happening. You know of happenings, which was
yeah.
music playing backwards, weird things, people in robes, people naked, whatever, doing crazy things. And so they decided they would hold one of those in the painfully sophisticated milieu of Cambridge undergraduates who've just come up, And so really, there was this room in this pub with people standing watching while other people sort of walked around with, I don't know, gas ovens on their heads or doing crazy things. And they were the audience was saying, yeah, I think Max Ernst did that in 1933, didn't he? Yeah. So the, complete sort of not drawn into it. They were outside watchers. And so seeing that, knowing the links between surrealism, Dadaism, and Magick, I decided that I wanted to hold a ritual and try to get over that boundary between the watchers and the performers. And I based it very much on Crowley's thing about, what did he call it? The dramatic ritual.
The Rites of Aloysius or something like that.
First thing I did is I said to people who, I put an advertisement in the university magazine and got people together. And I said, there's no watchers in this. You're all going to be made anonymous. You'll turn your robes, your university gowns on back to front. I'll make sort of hooded masks that go over your head, so you're all totally anonymous. So you're not thinking, oh, heck, I've got to do something, because I'm being watched. And I'll just give you the instructions of what you've got to do. And I did a ritual which began on those lines. And so they were all involved in it, and they were all separate from each other. And at the end, when I met people afterwards, they said that was incredibly powerful, because I had explained that I was sort of exploring the edges between art and magic, and I'm using magical methods, the dramatic ritual. Because one of the things of dramatic ritual is that you rehearsed it very carefully up to the climax. And the one thing you don't rehearse, according to Crowley, is the climax. Only the main character knows the climax and rehearses it. So everyone's doing these actions, not knowing quite what's coming. And so when the climax happens, they're unexpected. They're not prepared for it. And it's something surprising. And that is a lot of the invocatory aspect of the magic. And then you end up with an impromptu based on what arises. Now, the people afterwards said, it was really weird because, and it's my nature, you didn't cast a great mystery and sort of, meet me in the graveyard at midnight and blah, blah, blah. And I am a great magician. And I've got a history going back thousands of years and blah, 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 and all that stuff. You spoke very rationally that what you were doing, you explained what you were doing, an artistic experiment, bringing in magical elements. And they said, that was fine. But once we were in the semi-dark with these hoods on and everything, we weren't talking to each other. We all began to think, what's really behind this? Is this some weird cult that we've got into? Is he channeling some weird stuff from another dimension or that? And they couldn't ask anyone, say, what are you thinking? And they said that was incredibly powerful. they went into the unknown, and yeah, I mean, it blew some people's minds. And as far as I was concerned, the whole thing was a disaster. I went home sobbing that evening,
Oh
but
no.
actually, it was an incredibly powerful experience for all of us. And it was, I really had invoked the trickster, because there was I being as open and as honest and not fooling anyone. But that very fact meant I was the ultimate fooler in the end. Yeah. No, so that was, it was what you said that sort of triggered that to me. Yeah. So an artist, if you if you sort of bring that element into an artistic production, you may be doing much more than you think. And the one that occurred to me as you were speaking was, the movie Eyes Wide Shut?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Now, there's a scene in that when, the person comes into this sort of cult situation in disguise. He finds himself in this thing. And all that they do is they have people dressed in sort of robes with hoods and doing these sort of rather sinister movements, going thump, thump, thump with the staff. And that scene I found incredibly eerie and powerful, particularly when you think this person is in that, not knowing what it's all about. And really, all he's done is taken the very simplest, most cliched ideas of a magic ritual: robes, incense, flames, darkness, and presenting it in the middle of this movie produces a very powerful and sort of haunting feeling. Well, it did for me, even though I have a lot of experience with magic. Still, and I think sort of artists can, it's what they invoke in the audience if they decide to go down the route of, magic pentacles and symbols and goats' heads and all that. It can evoke a lot more in the audience.
Yes.
They think they're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, Eyes Wide Shut, it's funny because it's it's always struck me as, well, this is what chaos magicians would do if they had a budget. They just don't have the budget for this. But yeah, yeah. Were you ever able to speak with Genesis? I think you mentioned talking with her in your videos about the process. Did you have a communication there?
Yeah, I was working with quite a few of the Topi people, but as far as I only remember one, having dinner with him on one occasion. So I don't really know him very well.
This was in the 80s when Jen was still in Brighton.
Yeah, yes, that was it. And let me think. I actually met him in the West Country. A friend of mine was a Topi person, and said, "Oh, you must meet Jen and come to supper together." And that was when I think we talked about the process. And he said how he was very fascinated by it. And I think, as I did in that video, I said, that I'm not really a joiner and I was living in the deep country. So it was very much a rich kids in London thing. But I found it artistically fascinating, their magazines. And when I went to London, I'd buy every one I could. So I had an almost complete collection of the really good magazines they were doing when they were in England. I didn't have the very first one, but I had all the later ones. And he said he would love to see those. And I said, I'll give you them. And in return, what he did is he gave me photocopies of those plus all the stuff that he had, because he had some of the later things and some of their essays and articles, things like that, which I didn't find so, quite interesting. But, really, to me, the best thing was those those magazines and the images and the way that they suggested powerful ideas through simple imagery. That was what really caught me about the process. He sort of, he was very, I gathered he used some of their thinking and their ideas to build a movement, but he was very key. He tried very hard to avoid that hierarchical thing, which would have put him at the top. He was trying to keep it democratic, if you like, or horizontal, because he could see how quickly the power structure. It's almost like you've planted a seed bed where the power structure is bound to grow in there. And you've got to keep trimming it to keep it, stop that happening.
Yeah, as you may know, I was very close with Jen for a long time and studied with her and lived with her for a while in New York for almost 7-8 years. But the reason I bring Jen up is because she would always talk about a lot of the stuff that you've just mentioned, just of theater, experimental theater actions in universities in England in the 60s, or the process, or that that process, if you will, of breaking down the wall between the audience and the performer. And that was really her stock in trade. And I have to say, it makes me happy listening to your videos, because I spent so much time with Jen listening to her talk about the 60s, and I haven't just had that in my life until I started watching some of your videos talking about it. So it was a good feeling for me. Yeah.
Well, one cooperation in London, sometime in, I think about the mid-80s, they decided to do the rites of Eleusis, that Crowley had done this set of rituals which were performed in London for the planets. So, there'll be one on one day, they'd do Mercury, another on Jupiter, another on the sun. And there were these rites of Eleusis, which were written up and published. Now, they decided to run that sequence of rituals in London. But they also decided that, because it's quite an obligation, quite complicated, and they decided to give different groups to do each ritual. So each ritual would be done by a different group, and they would be given freedom to do it the way they wanted to. And I was in the group that did Jupiter, and I can't remember very much about it, but we sort of we followed more or less the Jupiter ritual, and yeah, I can't remember much about it. We did actually, but I was fascinated because Topi did the Mercury ritual, and they did something which now would be pretty insignificant, but to me it was mind blowing at the time, because of this was the leading edge of technology at the time. They did their performance on the stage, and they were continuously taking photographs and putting them into a fax machine and sending those images out around the world. Now, of course, with the internet, that's nothing now, but there was a ritual being held in London, and the imagery of it was going out around the world to different people. And that, for Mercury, was a sensational thing for me, a sort of so mercurial and so modern and so absolutely immediate and now. So I love that sort of experimentation. And I'll never forget that. Although, as I say, in a way they were, years ahead of their time, and now you would just send the thing out on the internet all around the world. But it was a breakthrough for me, the thought of using the latest mercurial communications to take the ritual out of space and time and send it around the world.
That's great. I remember Phil Hine told me at one point a really funny story from that time period of being at, I think in Oxford or somewhere like that, a super, super serious thelemic symposium where everyone's kind of giving their talks on Typhonian sex magic and this type of thing, and being very, very stuffy about it. And then Topi showed up and just put on a video of sex magic actions they'd done, and everyone descended into a fit of tittering, kind of schoolboy laughter.
Oh yes, I
They
think
couldn't handle it.
It was my friend Louise Hodgson was
Ah.
very involved with that. Yes, she was my contact, my main contact with Topi. The other was what's he called himself? The guy who published the first edition of Blast Your Way to Megabucks was another Topi person. And then, of course, Carl Abrahamson, because I was thinking of him when you were talking about, the sort of symbiosis between the world of art and the world of magic, because he's very much on that occulture part of the spectrum, isn't he?
Yes.
Carl Abrahamson and Fenris Wolf.
Definitely. Interesting. Well, maybe let's move forward a bit. I think that one of the things I really, really, really wanted to talk to you about, particularly because you've been doing recent videos on it. I just watched the one you put out yesterday about, conspiracy thinking and populism, is that in our current time period, once you get out of a culture, right, and you just look at the world as it is now, we do seem to have been thrown into this kind of mass magical thinking, or possibly, mass hysteria, mass delusion, where I think you were saying earlier in the interview, people feel that the firmament, hasn't been able to stand, and that nobody quite knows what's real anymore, and that consequently people seem to me to have grouped up into power groups. So it's become a question of who can shout loudest. They get to decide what reality is. And I think that we never saw that so clearly as during the pandemic, where suddenly everyone is kind of stuck at home in this world of delusions and ghosts in their own head and just on the internet, and whatever you want to believe about what's happening, you can find on the internet, and suddenly there's no truth. I found this, obviously very personally distressing, and for all the obvious reasons. But as a magician, the idea of being at home kind of in a semi-hallucinatory state was certainly not new to me at all, right? But I'm really, really curious of just your perceptions, magical or otherwise, about the state that we've been thrown into now during COVID and now semi-post-COVID, because I think that people's perceptions and their way of approaching the world and their assumptions about the world have changed so radically in ways that we probably don't even realize yet, and they will be for a long time. So I really, really just wanted to ask you about your thoughts about what has happened and where we are.
Yeah. Now, an image came to my mind as you were saying that. I mean, sometimes I'm speaking through ignorance because I'm not in the thick of things, but I am an intuitive, and I sort of pick up, just thinking of what you were saying. I had the image of, these flood disasters, like a tsunami, and, a village, a town washed away, and people struggling through the debris. Now, I think that our culture over certainly the last 100 years is very much the materialist reductionist, the search not for truth in the big sense. It's less than that. It's which is true, which is false. It's a simple binary sort of view of the world. So take this the war with Ukraine. Everyone is sort of saying, yeah, but what's the actual truth? There's the Russian version, and there's the US or Western version. And tendency is to believe the side you're on, so I am more drawn to the Western version than I am to the Russian version. But I have to remind myself that I don't actually know. I read The Economist articles, which are very good. They're very well explained, and they make a lot of sense. But The Economist is very much a Western mouthpiece. How much can I trust it? And I realize I have to watch out for confirmation bias. The articles I love reading are about the incompetence and failure of the Russian army. And I realize I enjoy those articles because it fits my belief that a dictatorship based on power and censorship eventually breaks down because it loses touch with reality. So you see, I love those articles, but I have to remind myself that that's why I love those articles, because it confirms my beliefs. And therefore, I must always have that pinch of salt. So here are people who are aware that truth is very malleable. Even videos of dead people in streets could be taken from a different war. They could be faked. They could be photoshopped. But they'd be brought up to believe that there is a truth, that of any story, there must be one thing which is the true story, and all the rest are the illusions we're being spun for us. Now, my analogy with the floodwater post-tsunami is that all these people are floundering in the water, trying to find things to grab onto. You know, a piece of furniture floats past, wooden furniture, they grab it, you know, to save themselves. Everyone's trying to grab onto some bit of truth, some fragment of truth, which they can trust to save their lives. It's that hungry. And the magic part of me says, why don't they just learn to swim?
Yes.
You know, magic is about plunging yourself into this and yourself finding how to float in weirdness and to Now, it certainly helps, particularly at the beginning, to have little bits of things to hold on to, you know, a bit of psychology, a bit of quantum theory for some people. That's helpful, but actually the real magic is when you learn to swim and let go of needing those little bits of certainty and really let yourself go with the flow of it. Yeah.
I completely agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. So I think that sort of addresses your question. It doesn't answer it. None of my things actually answer, but I think that addresses your question, doesn't it? It's like people are reaching for those floating objects to try to find something that'll save them, rather than they haven't yet really learned to go with the flow.
Yeah, I agree. I've felt this way for a long time, in the sense that these are, you know, that and I the learning to swim or learning to surf metaphor is really ideal. I think that particularly chaos magicians just learned to swim a long time ago, and so none of this is that disconcerting. But because of that reason, I think I really underestimate there's just the profound existential anxiety and stress that people have been feeling, as, to be frank, what chaos magicians always wanted to happen has happened. You know, it's like okay, here you go, here's your the eschaton is long since immanentized. And now we do live in the post-truth world, and it's kind of unpleasant, but is certainly nothing new if you've already been, I wouldn't even necessarily say a magical thinker, but a more chaos magical thinker, just for the reason that you say, which is that so many people just find, you know, they get their ascended master or Crowley or quantum physics or something that they cling on to as this is why magic works and this is why it's true, instead of just lightening up a little bit. But
yeah, I think that it's very natural to grab for a floating table to hold on to, and I wouldn't say it's wrong. You know, many people's lives are saved by finding something they can hold on to, whether it's a conventional religion or a cult or something, to get them over that. But it's the thought that you have to do that, and without it, you're going to die, which is misleading. And in one of my videos, I think it was the one which was surviving in a post-truth world, I drew the strongest analogy with magical thinking when I said that what you should be asking when a politician makes a statement or like that, this was particularly days when Trump was very much in the ascendant, people rush to try to find out if what he's saying is true or not. And there's this huge debate, between the people who say, oh no, if you look at the figures, Trump's talking absolute rubbish. And other people saying, but can you trust those figures? I feel that what he's saying is true in my area, blah, blah, blah. And so a huge energy and argument going into whether he's saying is true or not. And I say, save a bit of that energy and instead ask, why is he saying it?
Yes.
Why is the politician saying that?
I love that. Yeah. By the way, did you ever look into Trump's interest in magic?
Not really. I think I listened to, was it one of your...
Gary Lockman.
Yeah, that was a Gary Lockman. And I think also Michael Hughes.
Oh, yeah, that was a while ago. Yeah, I can't remember what was in that, but...
Yeah, so I sort of, as I say, from the distance, I got a taste of it, but I don't really know. I would have to ask you about that.
It's pretty. I'm amazed people didn't pick up on it more in the sense that, I mean, it's in a pretty straightforward way. It's that he grew up interested in positive thinking and the power of affirmations and that type of thing, and he wrote when he was in his earlier period. He was writing all these kind of popular financial books with Robert Kiyosaki and things like this, and Trump University. And I just remember going to the public library and opening up a bunch of Trump's old books. And just the minute the first page I opened them up to, he's talking about Kabbalah and Carl Jung. And it's just like, what is going on? And apparently he was just full on into the, or is, just full on to it, and just really embodies this really kind of in the true sense, like magical stance of it's true because I say it's true, of just putting your will out into the world without any, without any need to prove it. And that's just it's just such an advantage over other people who, like you say, just then get caught up in the, oh, well, what did the stats say? It's like, well, he didn't look at any of those. He's just saying things as they come to him.
Yes, that's it. Yeah, that's it. Gosh, I'm stunned to hear that. Part of me is saying, oh, bring it on. Let's have Trump back. Oh my God, how awful. What am I responsible for? Yeah, gosh, that's, but just in that piece about, surviving the post-truth world, I said, start practicing it on adverts, because you see, adverts are deliberate attempts to, and the thing is, it's easier because that they're just trying to influence you and they're not necessarily saying the truth. And so you get something like Coca-Cola saying it's the real thing. Do you go to laboratories to try to test Coca-Cola and see how real it is? It's just it's a truism, isn't it? If it's Coca-Cola, it's real Coca-Cola. Why do they say it then? And you realize, well, to me, it's dead obvious that they had this rival Pepsi Cola. And if they say Coca-Cola, it's the real thing, they're casting that little bit of doubt that Pepsi Cola isn't the real thing.
Ah, yes, that's good NLP.
So it's sort of transparent, you see. If you sort of practice with adverts, why are they saying that? And sort of see what little magical current they're trying to set in motion, what doubt, what belief. That's good practice. And then you can start looking at what the politicians are saying. No,
I agree. I actually worked in advertising for a while, specifically to learn the magical techniques they were using. And yeah, absolutely. And the casting of glamours. And these are, I think, just things that are just obvious to magical thinkers, but that are not to people who don't have that inclination. And, I would say... I would say I'm right there with you, saying, maybe this is hopeful. Maybe people will learn to swim a little bit. But I think what we've seen instead is either total reactionary terror on all sides of the political spectrum, clinging to what, this has to be the truth,
and violently, and you know, and if need be, in many people's cases, unfortunately. But the other thing is, you mentioned, you know, very bravely that you could be having confirmation bias reading The Economist, which is something that I'm sure most readers of The Economist would not agree with you on. They would say, well, no, this is definitely the truth. But the flip side of that is that when people when people start to get the doubt that you're talking about of, you know, well, maybe The Economist is either I'm, you know, reading things for my own confirmation bias, or even this is perhaps propaganda and is, you know, even the supposedly objective stuff is said for a reason, perhaps to demoralize in some way the Russian army, or to moralize the people on the western side of the conflict, to inculcate the belief that they're winning. But once most people get that feeling of, oh, I'm perhaps what I'm reading in what I'm told is true is not true, then they flee to conspiracy thinking, which is a much worse version of confirmation bias, because now they've thrown out the idea that they kind of rush headfirst into the idea that, well, if this is not true, then anything that is with me in the opinion that the prevailing narrative is not true must be the truth, in that binary thinking way that you're talking about. And then they just get, and then without a magical viewpoint on that stuff, which is just, oh, well, this is interesting, let's see what thinking this way feels like. But rushing headfirst into that, looking for the truth, I think that's really where we've been at because of the internet for a long time. And just people are, I think, as I mentioned before, just deciding what they want the truth to be, and then clumping up into big groups to shout, who can shout loudest.
There's another aspect of that. Do you see that people people come, as you say, from a very sort of dualistic true or false perspective. So if I describe that the way I've described you, some people say, I see, yes, as a magician, then you don't believe anything other people are saying, you know. Now, it isn't, that's just a part of the way along the journey. In my years of magical thinking, I suggest that magical thinking gives you a games layer, which is above the truth layer. You see, the sort of Platonic cave metaphor, you know, that we're in this cave and we're looking at shadows on the wall of the cave. And if we can turn around to see the light and the things that are casting those shadows, then we won't be deceived, because we'll see what the truth is. And I said, yeah, it's a great, powerful idea. But the trouble is, different people have different truths. The Christian will say, well, this world is actually an illusion. You know, God, there's another world of spiritual world, which is the truth. And we're just looking at those figures on the cave and all that, you know, and we're being deceived by the devil. And the scientists say something very similar. They say, yes, you may think you've seen magical things and all that, but it's your brain is tricking you into seeing these things, you know, because the truth is this material world that you can test and so on and so forth. And I said, that's great, but there are quite a few different truths that these people will tell you. You know, there's the Buddhist truth, the Hindu truth, and so on and so forth, the scientific truth. And so the magician really has got another layer beyond that truth layer. And I called it the games layer, because it's a game, because particularly chaos magicians, you might say, oh, I saw you using the tarot. So you think that is the model of the universe, and that's the universe. And someone else was using the Yi King. So they think we're living in a binary universe. And actually, the chaos magician, he would use the tarot one day, he would use the Yi King another day, he would use the pagan gods one day, he would use something weird like Marvel comic gods or something the other day. It's like, instead of this belief that, I have found the truth behind reality, it's which is the truth which is working best for me today. And this is one of the chaos magic exercises, isn't it? Become a fundamentalist Christian for a day, become a Muslim for a day, become whatever for a day. And so when a politician, say like Trump, presents you with his vision of making America great, as a magician, you can take that with a big pinch of salt, and you say, why is he saying that? Now, actually, he's inviting you to play a game. And you could say, if you happen to be living in a very, Rust Belt town, Motown, that was making a fortune out of making cars and is now half the shops are boarded up and this, that, and the other, you might find Trump's ideas rather appealing, and it might be quite good for that town. So he's offering a game which you might decide to go along with. Now, the difference is between you and the average Trump supporter is you realize that you've committed, because if it isn't working out, if America isn't becoming great, if actually becoming fractured, this, that, the other, is losing its reputation in the world, you could say, oh, well, that game hasn't worked for me. I'm going to try another one. But the trouble is the person who's chosen Trump because they've made up their mind, he is right, he is true, and they're clinging on to that. If it doesn't work, if America isn't becoming great, it can only mean that someone else is sabotaging it. Who's the enemy that's causing this, everything to go wrong? You've made a commitment, means you've taken one side in a war rather than one side in a game, which is just one of several games you could play. And I think that is the sort of the next step in magical thinking, to realize that it is you as an individual who is going to decide whether you're going to try these games. And because you're doing it in that spirit, you're not trapped in them. You really are, and you could even say you're like a scientist trying it out under laboratory conditions, the laboratory of your own soul. How well does this work for me? And very often you'll find that what the politician is trying to sell you, or the product that the marketers are trying to sell you, was tasty for a very short time, but you grow out of it. You realize that, no, that's not the real thing. And you can go on looking. Yeah.
I think that's so clearly put. Yeah, that's much more clear than I could have put it, because you're much better at not using jargon than I am. I used to say, the phrase I used to use was multivalent truth, the idea that there can be many truths operating at the same time, but just saying that it's different games is so much better. And I think it's a better metaphor than stories also, because stories, the idea that you could go from one story of the world to the other doesn't imply interactivity. It's the idea that, which I suppose it's not for most people. But I love that, and I think that also kind of points to what the true danger of magic is, which is that you forget that everyone else does not have that perspective necessarily, and they really are kind of stuck in these reality tunnels.
Oh yeah, hey, it's funny that about jargon, because as soon as you said, what was it, multivalent
truth.
Multivalent truth, I thought, oh, I love that. Try and remember it. I probably won't. I'll be too embarrassed to use it, but yeah, I think it's great. Sometimes I hear these jargons and thought, oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. But then you
can't quite bring myself to use them.
Well, I actually haven't used it that much, but but just saying that different things are games, or using, one of the interesting things I found about magical writing, looking back, is that it always uses whatever the current technological metaphors are. So for instance, all the writing and the New Thought writing in the 20s and things like that, they talked about radio, the radio, the sense radio of your mind, and then quantum physics came along, and now it's kind of internet metaphors. And I think that although the internet is a great metaphor, one of the things that Austin Spare said, I think obliquely, of course you can always misunderstand whatever he said, is that one thing that I think I got from what he said was that humanity is always essentially losing power by externalizing metaphors for its own nature, so that and which I'm not sure that I agree with, but he basically said that all of our technology simply represents internal faculties that we've given up by excreting outside of ourselves to the culture that we live in the form of technology. But
Actually, that's interesting, isn't it? It's suggestive to me because I think of, say, the internet. Yeah, I can give a sort of closer example, and I can give one that has occurred to me in recent weeks. You see, it connects people up around the world. So we go to the internet to make those connections. Now, does it mean that 50 years ago, people around the world weren't connected? Well, actually, they were. So we go to the internet to connect to the world.
mm-hmm.
And I was saying, yeah, 50 years ago, was the world completely disconnected? No, there was still a sense of humanity, other people. And how was it transmitted? Well, sort of in culture and a feeling in oneself that was one as part of this bigger thing. And it's almost as though, now, I had another experience of that in recent years in meditating. I do this sort of often a sort of contemplative meditation where I sit and just quieten my mind. And I found I was constantly thinking up new things for videos, and I got this interesting relationship with my mind because some people say, oh God, I must stop that, I must calm my mind. And my mind is wanting to do something like keep making you think of another video. I treat it with respect. And I say, look, I'm trying to calm my mind. So, go away and come back later. And if it doesn't, I say, look, you really want me to do this, don't you? You're trying to prompt me. And I thought, why is it that I'm doing this more now? And I realized that something which is missing from my life is waiting. And years ago, I said to Joel Barocco, and he remembered it, I said to him, waiting is a gift of time. You're stuck at a traffic light, which is in a car, and you're very frustrated because for a moment, you're just having to wait. And you're banging the steering wheel and think, oh, get on, get on, get on. And I think what I was saying to him was that actually, that means you've got about a minute where you could just meditate, just be there, just, open your mind to the experience. And you see that before having cell phones, room, they put out magazines for you to read. If they don't put out magazines, you just sit there and wait. But now what you do is you take out your cell phone and start messaging, things like that. So there's a whole factor of life which has gone, which is what do you do when you're sitting in a bus stop and the bus isn't coming along? Now, in the past, you could read the adverts on the bus stop, but really you would sit there and think. Now, a cell phone has taken that away from us because it's so instinctive. The moment you're stuck waiting for something to happen, you take it out and start doing things. So technology has replaced something which is quite fundamental in human life. You used to think about life and things. You used to reflect. Now, instead of reflecting, you receive material from cell phone. A natural internal function, which we've been with us for centuries, is almost because there's always something else you could be doing at that moment. Does that?
Yes. Yeah. I think we've also lost quite a lot of other things. Certainly, now that we live in a world where anything we want can just be brought to us by clicking something. and obviously a lot is there. A lot of the nuances of human communication, it goes without saying, are lost. I feel that podcasts are actually the only counterbalance to that, because it's the use of the internet to actually bring people together for long form conversation, which actually people didn't really do very much. They were always too busy rushing around and having, which obviously people still are, but people didn't really sit down to have long conversations before the internet. That didn't happen on TV. It didn't really happen on radio, even not in the same way, in the same unstructured way, where even with TV and radio, it was just, sound bites that you had to condense into 3 minutes, or maybe half an hour if you're lucky, with commercial breaks. And so
that was my magical, in the other sense of word, my magical memory of occult groups in the 80s was the time we spent sitting around in small groups, talking, really discussing the world. Very often it meant going to a fantastic tea house or something, like we would go down to have a day at West Kennet Longbarrow, and then we would go to the wonderful tea shop in Malmesbury to chat and everything. But it was a very, very intimate and sharing experience doing those things together. And I really miss that. And actually, this conversation we're having is the sort of thing we might talk about, and it's very valuable. It's great for me, here I am down in Cape Town, to be able to talk about these things with you, because you have a whole different sort of knowledge of what's going on because of your connections and the people you're with or deal with, and it's great. It's valuable.
that's definitely my memory of being in groups as well. And I also really miss that. And one of the things that I realized when I stopped being so active in groups is, and I think it's only become more and more clear to me over time, is it's not just that, it's almost like that type of experience of just that unstructured time sitting around and talking about the universe is itself an occult experience, because people don't have a chance to do it outside of that. But the other thing that groups are great for is talking about books. Like, people just don't, even reading seems to be an occult thing now. Like, people that are not necessarily literate, and certainly not literate in that type of information. And so just the idea of sitting around with people kind of talking about, comparing notes from books that you've read and talking about books at length, that is even just, you did a video recently about occult publishing, and how I thought that was really, really interesting, how it had basically venture capitalists left it in the 70s for technology, which is maybe what's really driving a lot of this. But even the idea of reading and talking to people about shared knowledge from books is for most people just a cult experience. I had an interesting experience maybe 5 years ago in Glendale in Los Angeles, going to a science fiction bookstore where it was almost all the books were from the 60s and 70s, because it kind of started to peter out after that. And just kind of being in these, I was in a writer's group with the writer Dennis Etchison, famous short, within that world, well-known horror short story writer. And I just remember having this experience of looking around at the 7, maybe 10 people in this bookshop, and nobody was coming in, and all the books were kind of from another time period. And I realized, like, this is a Gnostic world. This is like an occulted world now. Just reading science fiction or fantasy literature with other people, it's obviously kind of been dropped by the culture. Now it's just movies and video games and things like that. And just realizing, I just had this feeling like I felt like I was suddenly part of some kind of persecuted Christian sect in the 1st century or something like that. Or we were meeting in the catacombs so that we didn't get eaten by lions. And it was just like this profoundly sad realization too, just that that's happened so quickly within my lifetime.
There's something which I'm very much aware of in Britain, and that is the move to ebooks and reading them on Kindle and on things means that the paper book takes on a new significance. People say, I want the feel of it in my hands. And you get what they call talismanic publishing, and people like Jake Stratton Kent and Stephen Skinner, you republish something like say some of the works of John Dee, and you do a lot of research into it, and you add a preface or a forward and some footnotes, which sort of add value to it. So there's the original, you got it there, but you've got this added value of some expert thing. And the thing isn't just sort of made into a PDF or a Kindle book. They will bind it hand bound with a half bound leather cover, with a talismanic symbol on the front. And the book becomes an object, a talismanic object, which has value in itself. So you're reading this, you're absorbing this while holding an object that really has been made as a talisman. It's special, it's expensive, it's handmade in many respects. Now, that's quite a big thing in England, that people be doing these talismanic books.
Yes. I think there's really something to that. I think it I mean, it's obviously become a speculator market, but beyond that, I mean, that's why I wanted my John Dee book to be a hardback. Why that was so important, because it's almost like it brings it fully into manifestation, and the more solid it is, the more manifested it is, and that you just don't get that with Kindles. Like in theory, it's the same information, but it hasn't been birthed into the world really. And I think there's also something about physical books where just by buying it, you own it, and now you feel that you own the information, even if you haven't read it. So
particularly a very heavily illustrated book like yours, you want to be able to flip through illustrations and they catch your eye, rather than going flip, 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 flip on the pages of a Kindle,
Yeah. It's also in your life. It's in your house. It doesn't go away when you click out. So it's like, even if you don't read it, it's there, and you feel that it's part of your kind of energetic field, if you will.
Yeah. And I noticed that, in Zoom talks, people, until they got self-conscious about it, they had to have the right books on shelves behind their heads while they're talking.
Yes, like lawyer commercials. Yeah, I definitely used to do that.
I strained trying to read what the books are.
Yeah, very funny. Well, I think this has been a great conversation. I want to have you back on soon, maybe in a couple months even. I think we had a little bit of connection, dropout, which we're going to work on here. But I would like to perhaps regularly have you on the podcast, because I just enjoy talking with you so much.
Well, it's been great for me, I tell you. Yeah. I'm very pleased to speak to you direct, rather than just emails and things.
Oh, me too. Yeah, it's really important just to have that. And I think, just to your point earlier, what you were saying of feeling that missing that experience of talking with people in groups, or you said tea shops, things like that. Yeah, I mean, that's something that I miss. I miss being in groups. I miss even talking to Joel Barocco, as crusty as he and cranky as he can be. When I met him he was always so abrasive with me online. And then when I met him in person, he was just really nice. So as soon as people get behind a keyboard, they can suddenly become something that they're not. But Joel, by the way, is I should talk to him at some point, just because we've had such a weird abusive relationship, but he was really a pioneer in trolling, I have to say. Like, he was kind of the original troll in the 80s with his zines attacking people. He was really ahead of his time on that.
Yes, the chaos. Yeah, that's it. I got off fairly lightly from him, because I think we had a certain soul spirit to us, linking us. That I think he really liked my satirical column, the Satanist Diary, that I did, which I've eventually published, as a collected works, called the Hellgate Chronicles. And I think that he was very delighted to discover that the person who wrote the Hellgate Chronicles, or the Satanist Diary, was the same person who wrote articles which he liked.
That's great. Is there anything that I know that you just I think you just republished that, right? So is there anything people should know about of projects that you have out right now, that you have upcoming, and also where to find you online? I'm guessing probably your YouTube channel is the best spot.
The YouTube channel's best. Yes, I have got a website, but I keep meaning to find out how to put things onto the website. That for years it's been static. One project is that that's sort of simmering. Mog Morgan of Oxford, Mandrake of Oxford, said he would like to do a collected essays of mine. I did what I Blast Your Way to Megabucks. I did what I did in my holidays. And I've actually written quite a lot of essays since then, which have gone out to various magazines and things like that. And so I'm beginning to sort of go back to old computers and finding those.
Mm.
He happily will be prepared to put them together into a proper published book. So that's a sort of a project. It'd be nice to say for this year. I'm not sure if I'm that efficient.
Yeah, publishing is not speedy. That's great though. Yeah, I don't know if people really need websites anymore. By the way, I think that YouTube is definitely where it's at. YouTube and podcasts. So, but people should definitely check
quite
yours
like
out.
the brochureware aspect of a website. I hear of a company and I want to look and flip through its products and things like that.
Yes.
I still use it. I'm in that generation. Yeah.
So am I, and in terms of the early websites, and that's basically what my career has been, is writing on the web. So, but I do notice that the much younger generation is very much YouTube first and social media first. So I think that everyone should check out your channel. It's awesome.
Oh yeah. Oh well, that's great. I realize that I've got to 100 shows on it, which is amazing.
That's great. Yeah, and you just started adding new. I think you were kind of taking a break for a while, but you just started adding new videos again. So
see, for years I've been a hack writer, a ghost writer for industry, churning out stuff and living in terror if I haven't got work, living in terror if I'm overworked. Now, the joy of just doing a video when I feel moved to do it, and not feeling I have to churn something out at regular intervals, and to demand is wonderful.
Yes, it does get stressful when you feel that you have that pressure and you have to meet people's expectations, and especially with comments and things like that. And yeah, so suddenly it's not really yours anymore. So yeah, I get that. Well, thank you very much for being on, and I definitely hope to have you again on soon if you're game.
Yeah, yes, been great.
All right, you really enjoyed that. I definitely had a lot of fun in that conversation. Meet us at magick.me, magick.me, my school for magic, meditation, and mysticism, where you can learn all the skills you need to unleash your true self. I will see you in class, and until next time, hang in there.